The air in Memorial General's pediatric ward was thick with secrets, the tension between what could be seen and what was said hanging heavy in every corner. As Eleanor checks the charts of a mysterious little girl with unexplained injuries, a gnawing realization tightens her chest. Josephine's story is about more than just bike falls and childhood accidents. Each fracture and bruise tells a tale of deceit, shattering Eleanor's last sliver of doubt. Can Eleanor uncover the sinister truth lurking behind those wide, fearful eyes before it's too late? Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. Dr. Eleanor Reeves massaged her temples, the fluorescent lights of Memorial General's pediatric ward buzzing like angry wasps above her head. 36 hours into what should have been a 12-hour shift, the coffee in her system had long since turned to acid, burning away at her stomach lining with the same persistence as the questions burning in her mind. She glanced down at the chart in her hand, the name Josephine Mercer staring back at her, alongside vitals that told a story the 12-year-old refused to speak aloud. The bruising pattern was distinctive. Finger marks on the upper arms, a circular contusion on the lower back consistent with a knee pressed against spine, hairline fracture of the left wrist. Classic defensive injuries. The girl had claimed she'd fallen from her bike down a ravine near her home in the foothills outside town. The story made sense on paper, but paper didn't capture the way Josephine's eyes darted to the doorway every time footsteps approached, or how she flinched when Eleanor had reached for her stethoscope. Fourth visit in 8 months, Eleanor murmured to herself, flipping through the previous charts. Different injuries, same implausible explanations. A burn from a cooking accident, a sprained ankle from tripping on stairs, a concussion from falling out of bed. The progression disturbed her most, escalating severity, decreasing recovery time between incidents. Eleanor tucked a strand of her graying brown hair behind her ear and stepped into the room where Josephine sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her thin frame nearly disappearing into the oversized hospital gown. The girl's honey brown hair hung limply around a face that should have been round with childhood, but instead appeared gaunt, shadows beneath eyes too old for her years. "Hey, Joe," Eleanor said softly, using the nickname she'd learned the girl preferred during her previous stay. "How's the pain?" Scale of 1 to 10. Josephine shrugged, her eyes fixed on the cartoon playing on the small television mounted to the wall. 4, maybe? "The medicine helps." Eleanor nodded, making a note on her tablet. "Your mom should be here soon. She sounded worried when we called." Something flashed across Josephine's face. Not relief, but something darker. "Is Richard coming too?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Richard Mercer, Josephine's stepfather of 3 years. Former Army sergeant, current manager at the lumber mill that employed half the town. Respected community member. Youth basketball coach. The kind of man who brought donuts to the fire department on his way to work just because. "I believe so," Eleanor answered, watching carefully. "They're coming together." Josephine's fingers tightened on the thin hospital blanket. Could I stay here tonight? Just to make sure nothing's broken? I don't mind hospitals." What 12-year-old didn't mind hospitals? Eleanor perched on the edge of the bed, setting her tablet aside. "Joe, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that this room is safe. Whatever you tell me stays between us until you say otherwise." A half-truth. Mandatory reporting laws would require action if Josephine disclosed abuse, but Eleanor needed the girl to speak freely first. "Did someone hurt you? Not the ravine or the bike. Did a person do this to you?" Josephine's eyes remained fixed on the cartoon cat, chasing a mouse across the screen. "I fell," she whispered. "I told you already. You can tell me if." "I fell." The girl's voice cracked, her hands trembling. "Please, Dr. Reeves. I just fell." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Caroline and Richard Mercer. Caroline rushed to her daughter's bedside, her face etched with concern that appeared genuine to Eleanor's scrutinizing gaze. Richard hung back, his imposing frame filling the doorway, expression appropriately concerned but somehow distant. "My baby," Caroline cooed, smoothing Josephine's hair. "What happened?" "They said you were riding down by Miller's Creek again." I told you that area is dangerous. Richard stepped forward, his hand landing heavily on Josephine's shoulder. Eleanor didn't miss the way the girl's body tensed at the contact. Quite the daredevil we've got, huh, Doc? Always giving us heart attacks. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which assessed Eleanor with calculation. She'd met him during Josephine's previous visits, and something about him had always struck her as performative, a man playing the role of concerned stepfather rather than embodying it. She's got some nasty bruising and a hairline fracture in her left wrist, Eleanor explained, maintaining professional neutrality despite the suspicion coiling in her gut. We've set it in a cast. She'll need to follow up with orthopedics in 2 weeks. Of course, Caroline nodded. We'll take good care of her, won't we, Richard? Richard's hand remained on Josephine's shoulder, thumb moving in small circles. Always do. Eleanor turned to Josephine. I'm going to get your discharge paperwork started. Is there anything else you want to tell me before I go? The plea in the girl's eyes was unmistakable, but her mouth remained firmly shut, jaw clenched against words fighting to escape. She gave a small shake of her head. As Eleanor left the room, she heard Richard's voice drop to a register meant to be soothing, but carrying an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. Let's get you home, Joey girl. Your mom's made your favorite dinner. At the nurse's station, Eleanor hesitated over the discharge forms. Something wasn't right. She'd seen enough abuse cases in her 15 years of practice to recognize the signs, but without disclosure from Josephine or more concrete evidence, her options were limited. She'd already filed a report with Child Protective Services after Josephine's last visit, but their investigation had concluded with no findings. The Mercers were pillars of the community, their home immaculate, their explanations plausible. Dr. Reeves? The voice of Sandra, the charge nurse, pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. They're asking for the discharge papers. Mr. Mercer says they have a long drive home. Eleanor nodded, signing the forms mechanically while her mind raced. The Mercers lived 20 minutes from the hospital. Why would Richard call it a long drive? As Sandra took the papers, Eleanor made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives, including her own. I need to step out for a moment. Tell them I'll be right back to review home care instructions. Instead of heading to the doctor's lounge, as she'd implied, Eleanor slipped down the back stairwell to the parking garage. She located her aging Subaru and pulled it near the emergency exit, engine idling. 10 minutes later, she watched as Richard escorted Josephine to a black pickup truck, his hand gripping her upper arm in what could be mistaken for supportive guidance, but struck Eleanor as controlling. Caroline followed, carrying a small bag of Josephine's belongings, her face drawn with what appeared to be fatigue or worry. Eleanor's breath caught as she witnessed what happened next. As Richard opened the truck's back door, Josephine suddenly pulled away, turning to her mother with what appeared to be desperate words. Caroline's face hardened, and she said something sharp in response. Richard's hand returned to Josephine's arm, tighter this time, as he all but lifted her into the vehicle. The girl's face pressed against the window, her mouth forming words Eleanor couldn't hear, but could clearly read. Please don't make me go. In that moment, 15 years of medical training and ethical considerations collided with raw human instinct. Eleanor knew the system, knew how it could fail children like Josephine despite the best intentions, knew how reports could be filed and dismissed, how families could present one face to investigators and another behind closed doors. She put her car in drive. The black pickup headed not toward the Mercer's suburban home, but east toward the state line. Eleanor maintained a careful distance, her heart pounding as they left the city limits and merged onto the highway. After 30 miles, the truck exited onto a rural route winding through dense forest. Eleanor killed her headlights, relying on moonlight and the distant taillights of the pickup to guide her along the unfamiliar road. When the truck turned onto a narrow dirt track nearly invisible from the main road, Eleanor continued past, marking the location before finding a place to turn around. She parked where her car wouldn't be visible from the road and proceeded on foot, guided by the distant glow of lights through the trees. The property that emerged from the darkness sent ice through Eleanor's veins. A dilapidated cabin stood in a small clearing, its windows covered with heavy curtains. Behind it loomed a larger structure resembling a barn, though the heavy padlock on its doors suggested it held something more valuable than hay. The pickup was parked beside the cabin, its engine ticking as it cooled. Eleanor crept closer, using the trees for cover. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see into what appeared to be a kitchen. Richard was on his phone, pacing while Caroline sat at a table, head in her hands. There was no sign of Josephine. The sound of a door slamming drew Eleanor's attention to the barn. Richard emerged, pocketing a key, his face set in grim determination. He returned to the cabin, where his voice raised enough for fragments to reach Eleanor's hiding place. Last warning. Can't keep doing this. Buyers coming tomorrow. Buyers? Eleanor's medical mind cataloged possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Human trafficking? Drug manufacturing? What hell had Josephine been trying to escape? Eleanor retreated to her vehicle, hands shaking as she called 911. The dispatcher's voice seemed distant as Eleanor explained her suspicions, her position, the need for immediate intervention. She was told to stay in her vehicle, that state police were being dispatched, that they would arrive within 40 minutes. But Eleanor could not unsee Josephine's pleading eyes pressed against the truck window. 40 minutes might as well be 40 years. Decision made, she returned to the edge of the clearing, phone recording in her pocket. If nothing else, she would document whatever was happening here. As she approached the barn, a muffled sound stopped her, a child's voice, not just Josephine's but others. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Moving to a small window set high in the barn wall, she pulled herself up to peer inside. The beam of moonlight illuminated a scene that would haunt Eleanor's nightmares for years to come. 6 children, ranging in age from approximately 7 to 15, huddled on thin mattresses arranged along the walls of the barn. Their conditions varied. Some appeared relatively unharmed, while others showed visible injuries similar to Josephine's. Josephine herself sat apart from the others, her casted arm cradled against her chest, her free hand comforting a small boy whose quiet sobs shook his thin frame. They were dressed in clean but worn clothing, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed look of the chronically undernourished. Near the door stood a table laden with medicine bottles, prescription labels visible but unreadable from Eleanor's position, alongside what appeared to be medical supplies, gauze, bandages, antiseptic. This wasn't just abuse. This was systematic exploitation. The door to the barn suddenly swung open, lights spilling across the dirt floor as Richard entered. The children immediately fell silent, shrinking back against the walls. All except Josephine, who shifted to place herself between Richard and the sobbing boy. "Time for medicine," Richard announced, his voice carrying the false cheer of a man speaking to pets rather than children. "Line up now." The children obeyed with practiced efficiency, all except Josephine, who remained defiantly seated. Richard's false smile didn't waver as he approached her. "Joey girl," he said, the nickname now sounding like a threat. "You're setting a bad example for the others. We talked about this." "No more," Josephine said, voice small but steady. "I won't take it anymore, and neither should they." Richard's hand shot out, gripping Josephine's injured wrist. She gasped in pain, but did not cry out. "Your mother and I took you in when nobody wanted you. This is how you repay us. After everything we've done, you sell our blood," Josephine said, each word deliberate. "You take us to different hospitals when we're hurt so nobody notices. You tell them we're yours, and they believe you, because why wouldn't they? But I'm telling Dr. Reeves next time. I don't care what you do to me." Eleanor's mind raced to process this revelation. Blood farming, a horrific practice where victims are kept captive to harvest their blood for sale on the black market. The bruises, the recurring injuries, the medical supplies, it all aligned with this nightmarish reality. Richard's face contorted with rage. "There won't be a next time for you, Joey. The buyers coming tomorrow have special plans. Overseas clients who pay premium for young, healthy specimens. You've caused enough trouble." Eleanor had heard enough. Abandoning caution, she leapt from her position and ran to her car, retrieving the tire iron from her trunk. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, she approached the barn door, weapon raised. The lock would be difficult to break, but the recording in her pocket would ensure these children's story would be told, even if she couldn't free them herself. Before she could strike, headlights swept across the clearing as multiple vehicles approached. Not the police Eleanor had called, but a black SUV with tinted windows, followed by a van with no markings. The buyers arriving early. Eleanor ducked behind a stack of firewood as the vehicles parked. 3 men emerged from the SUV, their bearing professional clinical. From the cabin, Richard and Caroline appeared, Caroline nervously smoothing her hair while Richard approached the men with a handshake. "You're early," Richard said, his tone carefully respectful. "Change of plans," replied the lead man, his accent vaguely Eastern European. "Our client moved up the timetable. We need to inspect the merchandise now." Eleanor's grip tightened on the tire iron. These weren't just children to these people. They were inventory. Her phone continued recording in her pocket as Richard led the men toward the barn, Caroline trailing behind, wringing her hands. The decision that formed in Eleanor's mind wasn't the rational choice of a respected physician, but the desperate gambit of a human being confronted with unconscionable evil. She could not, stand by and record while children were sold like cattle. As Richard unlocked the barn door, Eleanor emerged from her hiding place, tire iron raised. "Stop right there," she shouted, voice steadier than she felt. "Police are on their way." The tableau froze for a heartbeat, Richard's hand on the door, the buyers turning in surprise, Caroline's face draining of color. Then chaos erupted. The buyers reached for weapons concealed beneath their jackets. Richard lunged toward Eleanor. From within the barn came the sounds of frightened children. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Eleanor swung the tire iron, connecting with Richard's shoulder as he reached for her. He staggered but didn't fall. One of the buyers raised a gun. Caroline screamed. And suddenly, the night exploded with flashing lights and sirens as police vehicles swarmed the clearing from multiple directions. Police! Everyone on the ground now. The buyers attempted to flee, but were quickly surrounded. Richard recovered from Eleanor's blow and tried to run toward the forest, only to be tackled by 2 officers. Caroline fell to her knees, hands raised in surrender, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor dropped the tire iron and raised her hands as officers approached, identifying herself. "The children are in the barn," she gasped. "At least 6 of them. They need medical attention." The next hours passed in a blur of statements, medical examinations, and the heartbreaking process of interviewing traumatized children. Eleanor learned the horrifying details of the operation. Richard and Caroline had been running the blood farming scheme for 5 years, targeting foster children and runaways. Kids the system had already failed, kids nobody was looking for. Except for Josephine, who had been Caroline's daughter from a previous relationship, initially spared until financial pressures led them to include her in their operation. The buyers turned out to be connected to an international organ trafficking ring, interested in expanding their business model. The blood farming had been profitable, but selling the children themselves would have brought a much larger payday. Had Eleanor not followed her instincts, had she not abandoned protocol to follow that truck, Josephine and the others would have disappeared without a trace. 3 months later, Eleanor sat in a different hospital room, watching as Josephine, now living with her biological father who had been searching for her since Caroline had disappeared with her years ago, carefully colored a picture of a doctor with a cape. "Is that supposed to be me?" Eleanor asked, smiling at the superhero depiction. Josephine looked up, her face healthier now, eyes brighter. "Yeah, Dad says you're my guardian angel, but I told him you're better than that. Angels just watch. You actually did something." Eleanor swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "I just follow my instincts. That's what heroes do," Josephine said with the simple certainty of youth. They listen to that voice inside that tells them something's wrong, even when everyone else ignores it. As Eleanor left the hospital that evening, she reflected on how a series of small decisions, to question, to follow, to act, had altered the course of so many lives. The system hadn't failed these children. The people within it had. herself included, by initially accepting implausible explanations, by prioritizing protocol over protection. It was a failure she had ultimately corrected, but one that would remind her forever that medicine wasn't just about healing physical wounds, but about seeing the human being behind the injury and hearing the pleas they couldn't always voice aloud. The other children from the barn had been identified and placed with families or in therapeutic foster homes. Richard and Caroline awaited trial on multiple felony counts. The trafficking ring was under international investigation, and Eleanor had returned to her shifts at Memorial General with a heightened awareness of the stories told by injuries and the silent pleas in patients' eyes. Some nights, she still woke gasping from dreams of what might have happened had she not followed that truck. Other nights, she dreamed of all the children she might have missed throughout her career, the silent sufferers whose eyes had begged for help she failed to provide. But on her best nights, she dreamed of Josephine's drawing, the doctor with the cape, and reminded herself that heroism wasn't about perfection but persistence, about following that voice inside that says something is wrong, even when everyone else tells you to mind your own business. Because sometimes that voice is the only one speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves.